I've been hiking for as long as I can remember. It's been my way of disconnecting from the constant buzz of technology and responsibilities. This particular trip was supposed to be a weekend trek through the rugged wilderness of western Montana in the fall of 2015. I was 29 then, confident in my skills, and eager to take on the challenge of a trail I'd never explored before. The morning started perfectly. The weather forecast had hinted at a chance of rain, but the skies were blue when I set out. My route took me through rolling hills, dense pine forests, and rocky outcrops. By midday, I had climbed a modest ridge and found myself overlooking a vast valley dotted with the entrances to natural caves carved into the cliffside. The caves were mentioned briefly in my guidebook as a natural curiosity, but they weren't marked on any official maps. My plan had been to camp in the open under the stars, but as I stood there, the first raindrops splattered on the ground, quickly followed by a low rumble of thunder. I had two choices: continue downhill to the valley below, where the terrain looked muddy and unstable, or find shelter in one of the caves. The decision was easy. I was already drenched from the unexpected downpour, and the wind was picking up, so I decided to explore the caves for a dry spot to wait out the storm. There were at least 5 visible cave entrances scattered along the ridge, each varying in size. Some were no more than shallow depressions, but one stood out, a gaping black maw that looked large enough to swallow a car. I hesitated briefly. The smaller caves seemed less intimidating, but they looked cramped and damp. The largest one appeared deeper and more protected from the elements. With the rain coming down harder, I chose the big one. Inside, the temperature dropped immediately. The air smelled of wet stone and earth, and my headlamp revealed a sloping floor littered with rocks and debris. Water trickled down the walls in places, forming small pools. The ceiling arched high above, disappearing into shadows. The sound of the wind outside was amplified here, rushing through unseen cracks and fissures in the rock. It wasn't a steady noise, but an eerie symphony of howls, whistles, and groans that seemed to come from all directions. I picked a flat spot against the wall, far enough from the entrance to stay dry, but close enough to keep an eye on the outside. The rain had turned into a full-blown storm, and sheets of water cascaded down the cliff face like impromptu waterfalls. The wind was so fierce that it occasionally blew the water upward, creating a chaotic spray that splashed into the cave. I unpacked my gear, spreading out my damp sleeping bag and pulling on a dry shirt. It wasn't much, but it helped stave off the chill. As I sat there, eating a granola bar and sipping water, I became aware of other occupants in the cave. The first was a mouse, larger than I expected, with a patchy coat and beady eyes that gleamed in the light of my headlamp. It darted out from a crack in the wall, paused to sniff the air, then scurried back into the darkness. Soon, I saw others, their tiny feet scratching against the rocks. Then there were the spiders. I'd noticed their webs when I first entered, but hadn't paid them much attention. Now, as I sat still, I saw movement. They were everywhere, long-legged and glossy, clinging to the walls and ceilings. One dropped down on a thread near me, swaying in the draft. I flicked it away, trying not to think about how many more were lurking just out of sight. The storm outside was relentless. The wind screamed through the cave, the sounds morphing into something almost human at times. Long, mournful wails that made my skin crawl. Every so often, there was a loud crash from outside, like trees snapping or rocks tumbling. I told myself it was just the storm's fury, but each sound made me flinch. As the hours dragged on, the reality of my situation sank in. I was alone, miles from the nearest trailhead, in a cave filled with spiders and mice, with a storm outside that showed no signs of letting up. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, listening to the cacophony of wind and rain. Every so often, I heard rustling nearby, likely the mice, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows cast by my headlamp seemed to dance and shift, making the cave feel alive. At some point during the night, I heard a new sound. It was deep and resonant, like a low rumble or growl, but it wasn't the wind. It came from somewhere deeper in the cave. My heart raced as I sat up, scanning the darkness with my headlamp. Nothing moved. The sound didn't come again, but I couldn't shake the sense of unease. I considered packing up and moving to one of the smaller caves, but the thought of stepping out into the storm stopped me. The rain was still coming down in torrents, and the wind was strong enough to knock me off my feet. I decided to stay put, reasoning that whatever was in the cave, if anything, was probably more scared of me than I was of it. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. When dawn finally broke, the storm had eased to a steady drizzle. The cave entrance was slick with mud and water, and the ground outside was littered with branches and debris. I packed up quickly, eager to leave the eerie place behind. As I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. The cave entrance next to mine, the one I had considered before choosing the larger cave, was completely blocked. A massive pile of rocks and mud had collapsed over it, sealing it off entirely. The landslide must have happened during the night, likely one of the loud crashes I'd heard. My stomach churned at the thought of what could have happened if I'd chosen that cave instead. The realization was sobering. I hurried down the trail, slipping and sliding on the muddy ground. The storm had turned the landscape into a treacherous maze, but I was determined to put as much distance as possible between me and those caves. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was soaked, filthy, and utterly exhausted. I climbed into my car, cranking up the heat and sitting there for a long time, staring at the rain-streaked windshield. I never went back to those caves. The experience stayed with me, not just because of the storm or the close call with the landslide, but because of the unsettling sense that I wasn't entirely alone that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, amplified by the wind and the shadows, but even now, years later, I can still hear the howling in my dreams. I still laugh when I think about that 4th of July weekend, but not without a sense of dread and sheer disbelief at how it all went down. I'd been invited by my childhood friend, Andy, to spend the holiday at his family's cabin by Cedar Lake. It was a rustic place, nestled deep in the Vermont woods, about 2 hours from where I lived. The plan was simple: campfires, fireworks, and a few days off the grid with good food and even better company. Andy and I had been close since we were kids, and his family practically felt like my own. His parents were warm, laid-back people who loved hosting and always had something delicious cooking. They'd extended the invitation to me and a few others: Andy's cousin, Max, and our mutual friend, Greg. It sounded like the perfect summer getaway. The cabin itself was modest but charming. It had been in Andy's family for decades, with creaky wooden floors, mismatched furniture, and the faint smell of pine that always lingered no matter how many windows were open. Behind the cabin was a stretch of woods that led down to the lake, where a small dock and an old rowboat waited for anyone adventurous enough to take it out. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. We spent hours on the lake, swimming and fishing, before returning to the cabin to prepare dinner. Andy's parents had gone all out, grilling burgers, corn on the cob, and something I didn't expect: oysters. Oysters in Vermont? I was skeptical, but Andy's dad had a cooler full of them, freshly delivered from a friend who owned a seafood market. He showed us how to shuck them, and soon enough, everyone was digging in. Well, everyone except me. I'd never been a fan of oysters, but Andy's enthusiasm was contagious. He polished off at least a dozen, slurping them down with gusto and chasing them with a cold beer. The evening ended with fireworks by the lake. We set up chairs and watched as Andy's dad launched bottle rockets into the night sky. The air was filled with the smell of gunpowder and the sound of laughter. By the time we returned to the cabin, It was well past midnight, and we were all exhausted. The plan for the night was simple. Andy and I would share a tent set up in the clearing behind the cabin, while Greg and Max slept inside. It wasn't unusual for us to camp out, and the tent was a decent size, with enough room for 2 sleeping bags and a small opening at the bottom, a doggy door, as Andy called it, for ventilation. It didn't take long for things to go downhill. Sometime after we crawled into our sleeping bags, I noticed Andy fidgeting. At first, I thought it was just him trying to get comfortable, but the rustling grew more persistent. Then came the giggling. I was half asleep when I heard him chuckle. It was a strange, giddy sound, and it made me crack one eye open. Andy was lying on his side, his head near the doggy door, shaking with laughter. Before I could process what was happening, a low, guttural noise filled the tent. The smell hit me before my brain registered what was going on. It was like a physical force, a wave of something so vile and unholy that it felt like the air had been poisoned. My eyes started to water, and my throat burned as I tried to breathe through the assault. I bolted upright, gasping for any trace of clean air, but it was no use. The tent had become a sealed chamber of doom, trapping the noxious fumes inside. Andy's laughter only made it worse. He was completely oblivious to my suffering, too caught up in his own amusement to notice my frantic attempts to unzip the tent. Each time I thought the stench couldn't possibly get any worse, another wave hit, sending me reeling. At one point, I was convinced I might actually die. My lungs burned, my head spun, and my stomach churned dangerously close to rebellion. Andy, meanwhile, had stuck his head halfway out the doggy door, still giggling like a maniac. I finally managed to fumble with the zipper and throw the tent open, collapsing onto the grass outside. The cool night air was a gift from heaven, and I gulped it down like a man who'd been underwater for too long. Behind me, the tent continued to exude its foul presence, a testament to the havoc wreaked by those oysters. It took a full minute before Andy emerged, still laughing, though he looked a little green around the edges. He tried to say something, but another low rumble from his stomach sent him running into the woods. I didn't follow. I spent the rest of the night outside, refusing to set foot back in that tent. The smell lingered, a haunting reminder of what had transpired. Andy eventually staggered back, looking pale and sheepish, and collapsed onto a blanket he dragged out from the cabin. The next morning, Greg and Max found us sprawled on the grass, looking like survivors of some unspeakable disaster. Andy tried to explain what happened, but he couldn't get through the story without breaking into laughter. Greg, of course, couldn't stop laughing either, and even Max, who was usually the serious one, had tears streaming down his face by the end. As for the tent, there was no saving it. Even after airing it out for hours, the stench refused to leave. I ended up rolling it into a trash bag and leaving it by the cabin's garbage bins, vowing never to speak of it again. Years later, Andy still brings up that night whenever we get together, always with the same mischievous grin. I can laugh about it now, but at the time, it felt like I'd been through some kind of initiation into the underbelly of camping horror. And let me tell you, I haven't touched an oyster since. A few years ago, back in May, I decided to spend a quiet weekend camping in a state park. I won't say exactly where. It's not the kind of memory I want to relive too often, but let's just say it was in a part of New Jersey that doesn't see too many visitors outside of summer. The park wasn't huge, but it had miles of trails, a small lake, and a cluster of campgrounds that stayed mostly empty in the off-season. I'd been feeling restless, stuck in the monotony of my office job, and thought some time alone in nature would help clear my head. I was in my mid-30s then, old enough to know better but stubborn enough not to care. Solitude, I figured, was exactly what I needed to reset. The drive out was uneventful. a mix of highways and winding back roads. By the time I arrived at the park, the sun was starting to dip behind the treetops. I checked in at the ranger station, a small, weathered cabin near the entrance, and signed the logbook. The ranger on duty glanced at me with mild curiosity but didn't say much. The campground was a mile or so into the woods, tucked away from the main road. When I pulled into the gravel lot, mine was the only car there. That should have been my first clue, but at the time I was thrilled. I'd have the whole place to myself. I chose a spot near the edge of the campground, where the trees were denser, and set up my tent. The air was cool and damp, the kind of weather that hinted at rain but hadn't quite delivered. I built a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and settled in to enjoy the quiet. It was peaceful at first. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As darkness fell, I stretched out in my chair and stared up at the stars. It was the kind of night that made you feel small in the best way, like the universe had finally paused to let you breathe. But then, around 11 p.m., it started to drizzle. The rain was light, more of a mist than anything, but enough to make me retreat into my tent. I zipped up the flap, turned on my flashlight, and lay back on my sleeping bag, listening to the soft patter of raindrops on the nylon. It was soothing at first, and then I heard the singing. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a trick of the wind or the distant hum of an animal. But as I listened, it became clear. It was faint, almost drowned out by the rain, but unmistakable. A group of children singing. It wasn't loud or cheerful, like you'd expect from kids around a campfire. It was slow, almost rhythmic, like a lullaby. The melody was unfamiliar, the words too muffled to make out, but the sound carried through the trees, growing louder and softer as if it was moving. I sat up, straining to hear. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, away from the campground. The logical part of me tried to explain it away. Maybe there was another group camping nearby, or a local family had decided to take a late-night hike. But it was Sunday night, and as far as I knew, I was the only person in the park. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The rain had picked up, a steady drizzle now, and the fire had burned down to glowing embers. The woods were dark, the trees casting long shadows under the faint light of the moon. The singing continued, the voices rising and falling like waves. It didn't seem to be getting closer or farther away, just drifting through the air, directionless. I told myself to stay put, that it wasn't my business to investigate. But curiosity has a way of overriding common sense. Grabbing my flashlight and a rain jacket, I stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately, the rain soaking through my clothes as I stepped away from the tent. The singing was still faint but persistent, pulling me toward the edge of the campground. I hesitated, shining my light into the trees, but the beam only reached so far. Beyond it was nothing but darkness. I took a few steps forward, then a few more, until I found myself on the trail leading deeper into the woods. The rational part of me was screaming to turn back, but something about the sound was compelling. It wasn't joyful, but it wasn't sad either. It was just there, echoing in the stillness. I followed it for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 15 minutes. The farther I went, the thicker the trees became, their branches twisting overhead like a canopy. The rain made the trail slippery, and I nearly lost my footing more than once. Eventually, I came to a small clearing. At first, I thought it was empty, but then my flashlight caught something. A structure, half hidden by the trees. It was a cabin, old and weathered, with a sagging roof and boarded-up windows. The singing seemed to be coming from inside. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The cabin looked abandoned, but the voices were clear now, more distinct. There was no mistaking it. A group of children singing in unison. I took a step closer, my boots sinking into the muddy ground. The air felt heavier here, almost suffocating. The singing stopped. The silence was deafening. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the cabin, my flashlight beam trembling as I tried to steady my hand. I wanted to leave, to turn and run back to the safety of my tent, but my legs wouldn't move. And then, from somewhere behind the cabin, I heard the crunch of footsteps on wet leaves. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. The footsteps grew louder, circling the clearing, deliberate and unhurried. I backed away, my breathing shallow, and tripped over a root, landing hard on the ground. The flashlight flew from my hand, the beam flickering as it rolled to a stop a few feet away. Scrambling to my feet, I grabbed the flashlight and bolted back the way I came. I didn't care about the mud, the rain, or the slippery trail. All I cared about was getting as far away from that cabin as possible. By the time I reached the campground, I was soaked to the bone and gasping for air. My tent was still there, untouched, but I didn't bother going inside. I grabbed my keys from the pocket of my jacket and ran to the car. The drive out of the park was a blur. I don't remember much, just the way my hands shook on the steering wheel and how I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. When I reached the ranger station, the cabin was dark, the lot empty. I didn't stop. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I realized I'd left most of my gear behind. My tent, my sleeping bag, even my phone. But I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. To this day, I don't know what I heard or saw that night. I've tried to rationalize it. A group of campers I didn't see, maybe, or my own imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know it wasn't that simple. I haven't been back to that park since, and I've never camped alone again. I decided to camp alone for the first time on a late September weekend in 2016. The crisp autumn air and the solitude of the wilderness seemed like the perfect remedy for the burnout I was feeling from work. I chose a secluded spot deep in the pine forests of Northern California, far off the beaten path. The idea of being completely alone, surrounded by towering trees and nothing but the sounds of nature, was both exciting and a little nerve-wracking. I arrived at the site around noon after hiking a few miles from where I'd parked my car. The location was everything I'd hoped for: hidden, quiet, and utterly undisturbed. The trees were dense enough to block most sunlight, casting a greenish shadow over the forest floor. A small clearing provided just enough space for my tent and a fire pit. The first few hours went smoothly. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and even managed to set up a small cooking area. For dinner, I planned to bake a few potatoes under the campfire stones, wrapped in tinfoil. It was a simple meal, but the thought of eating hot food under the stars made it feel like a treat. It was early evening when I first noticed the man. He emerged from the trees suddenly, as if he'd been watching me for a while. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he reeked of sweat and something sharp I couldn't place. His eyes were wild, darting around like a cornered animal. He muttered to himself, his words slurred and nonsensical, except for the occasional burst of profanity. I froze, unsure of what to do. He didn't seem threatening, just erratic. But being alone, miles from anyone, with a man who clearly wasn't in his right mind, was unsettling. He wandered around the edge of my campsite, muttering and gesturing, but never approached directly. After a few tense minutes, he stumbled back into the woods. I tried to shake off the encounter, convincing myself he was just a harmless drifter. Still, I couldn't fully relax. I kept my knife close as I prepared my dinner, the fire crackling as I buried the potatoes under the hot stones. The forest grew darker, the shadows stretching and deepening until the firelight was the only thing keeping the blackness at bay. I told myself I'd feel better in the morning, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a low growling sound. It was faint at first, almost blending into the background noise of the forest, but it grew louder, more menacing, until it was unmistakable. Something or several somethings was moving around outside my tent. My first thought was bears, but it didn't quite sound like one. The growls were more guttural, like a mix of a dog's snarl and something I couldn't identify. My heart pounded as I lay frozen, straining to listen. The growling stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of snuffling near the fire pit. That's when it hit me, the potatoes. I hadn't thought about how the smell of baking food might attract animals. I cursed myself silently for being so careless. The noises moved away after what felt like an eternity, fading into the distance. I waited, hardly breathing, until I was sure whatever it was had gone. Then, slowly, I unzipped my tent just enough to peer outside. The campfire had burned down to embers, casting a dim orange glow. I couldn't see anything in the clearing, but the tension in the air was palpable. Every instinct told me to stay inside, but I needed to make sure my food was buried properly or risk another visit. Cautiously, I stepped out, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The forest was eerily quiet now, as if it too was holding its breath. I checked the fire pit and saw that the stones had been shifted, the tinfoil torn apart. Whatever had been here was strong enough to dig through the hot coals. Satisfied that the threat was gone, I turned to head back to my tent, and that's when I saw it. A spider, huge and hairy, crouched on the edge of my sleeping bag. It wasn't quite a tarantula, but it was close enough to make my skin crawl. Its legs were thick, its body the size of my palm. My first reaction was to step back, nearly tripping over my own feet. I grabbed a stick and nudged the spider toward the tent flap, careful not to hurt it. It scuttled away into the shadows, but the encounter left me shaken. I hadn't zipped the tent properly when I went to check the fire, and the spider must have crept in during that short window. Lesson learned. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I didn't sleep much. I kept imagining more spiders, more growls, and the possibility of that man returning. By morning, I'd made up my mind to cut the trip short. I packed up quickly, double-checking everything to make sure I wasn't leaving anything behind. As I hoisted my pack and started the trek back, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hike out was nerve-wracking. Every crack of a branch or distant rustle of leaves made me whip my head around, expecting to see those wild eyes or hear that guttural growl again. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly brought me to tears. Driving away from that forest, I made myself a promise. No more half-prepared solo trips. No more leaving food out even if I thought it was safe. And definitely no camping spots that might be visible or accessible to strangers. I still love the outdoors, but that trip taught me a lot about the risks that come with being unprepared and too trusting of the wilderness. Not every danger out there is a predator or a storm. Sometimes it's the things you least expect that remind you just how vulnerable you really are. It was the summer of 2008, and my friend Kara and I had decided to go camping for the first time on our own. I was 19 and she had just turned 18. It felt like the perfect way to celebrate our newfound independence. Neither of us had much experience with camping, but we had enough enthusiasm to make up for it. Kara borrowed her parents' old tent, and I raided my dad's camping gear for a portable stove, a lantern, and a couple of sleeping bags that smelled faintly of mildew. We chose a small campground in upstate New York, tucked away in the Adirondacks. It wasn't completely remote, but it was far enough from any major towns to feel like we were getting a real taste of the wilderness. It wasn't peak season, so the place was relatively quiet when we arrived late on a Friday afternoon. The campground had a few designated areas near the front, with picnic tables, fire pits, and bathrooms nearby. There were only a handful of campers set up in that section, families mostly. Kara and I, eager for more privacy, decided to head to a more secluded area in the back. It was a bit more rustic, with fewer amenities and no one else around, which suited us perfectly. We spent the first couple of hours setting up the tent and arranging our gear. The clearing we chose was surrounded by towering pine trees, their needles forming a soft carpet underfoot. A narrow path led back to the main campground and the bathrooms, but otherwise, it felt like we had the forest to ourselves. After everything was set, we made a quick dinner of canned soup and crackers. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the air grew cooler, and the woods came alive with the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. That peace didn't last long. Around dusk, we heard the low rumble of engines approaching. Two massive trailers pulled into the back section of the campground, parking in the clearing directly across from ours. From each trailer poured what seemed like entire families. Adults, kids, even a couple of barking dogs. Kara and I exchanged uneasy glances. We'd chosen this spot for its quiet, and now it felt like the circus had come to town. But we decided to make the best of it. After all, the campground wasn't ours alone. The adults from the trailers wasted no time unpacking coolers of beer and setting up folding chairs around a roaring fire. The kids, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, ran around shrieking and laughing as the dogs darted between them. It was chaos, but it didn't bother us too much at first. We called it a night around 10 p.m., crawling into the tent and zipping ourselves into our sleeping bags. The noise from the trailers was still going strong, loud laughter, clinking bottles, music blaring from a portable speaker. We figured they'd settle down eventually. By midnight, the noise had finally started to die down. The kids had disappeared into their trailers, and the music stopped. Kara and I were just starting to drift off when we heard footsteps crunching on the path outside our tent. It wasn't just one person. It sounded like a group, their voices low and slurred. The footsteps passed by, heading toward the bathrooms. We didn't think much of it at first, probably just some of the adults from the trailers. But then, out of nowhere, something hit the side of our tent with a loud thud. We both froze. My heart raced as I listened for more sounds. A few seconds later, I heard someone stumbling around outside, muttering something incoherent. Then another voice, louder this time, shouted, "Rawr! I'm a bear!" Kara grabbed my arm, her breathing quick and shallow. I could feel her fear radiating off her, but I wasn't sure what to do. Were they just drunk, or were they trying to scare us on purpose? The stomping and growling continued for what felt like an eternity, circling the tent. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe they didn't know we were in here. Maybe they thought the tent was empty, and this was some dumb joke. But what if they weren't just messing around? Eventually, the noise faded, and the footsteps retreated back toward the trailers. We stayed awake for hours after that, every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig setting our nerves on edge. I didn't even realize I'd fallen asleep until I woke up to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight streaming through the tent. The campground was quiet when we emerged, the air crisp and cool. The trailers were still there, but the families were stirring. Kids chased each other around while one of the men, bleary-eyed and still holding a beer, half-heartedly tossed a frisbee to a little boy who couldn't have been older than 4. Kara and I packed up quickly, eager to get out of there. As we rolled up the tent and stuffed our gear into the car, we couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of the night before. It was clear the adults from the trailers had been too drunk to care about much of anything, let alone 2 girls camping nearby. Later, when we told our parents about the trip, they were horrified. Not about the drunk campers, but about the fact that we'd gone alone in the first place. A couple of years later, the campground implemented a rule barring teenagers from camping without an adult. The irony wasn't lost on us. Kara and I, two responsible teens just trying to enjoy nature, had been far better behaved than those so-called grown-ups. Looking back, it's a story we tell with a mix of humor and disbelief. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest things aren't bears or wilderness hazards, but the unpredictability of the people you share the world with. My partner and I have always loved getting away from the world by escaping into the mountains. It's become an annual tradition, a much-needed reprieve from the chaos of everyday life. This past weekend, we decided to return to our usual camping spot, a secluded patch deep in the Adirondack Mountains, far off the beaten path. It's not a place you'd find in any guidebook, and that's exactly what we love about it. Usually, we might see one or two other people, maybe a hunter or a fisherman, but they're always miles away. The solitude is what makes the spot so special. We've spent countless nights under the stars there, just us and the wilderness. This year, we brought along my parents' dog, Max. He's an older terrier mix, small and calm, the kind of dog who's happy to curl up at your feet no matter where he is. He's joined us on these trips before and always seems to enjoy the fresh mountain air. When we arrived, we were surprised to find the entire area completely empty. No cars parked along the gravel pull-off, no signs of life on the trails, nothing. Struck us as odd, but not alarming. If anything, we were excited to have the whole mountain to ourselves. We set up camp in our usual spot, a small clearing surrounded by dense pine forest with a view of a distant ridge. The air was warm, and the sun cast long shadows through the trees as it began to set. We built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and cracked open a few beers. The quiet was almost unnerving. No distant voices, no sound of footsteps or crackling fires from other campers. Just the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. As night fell, the silence deepened. Max stayed close to the fire, his little body stretched out in the dirt, his ears twitching now and then. When it was time to turn in, we crawled into the tent, leaving the mesh flap unzipped to let in the cool breeze. Max, usually content to curl up and fall asleep instantly, was restless. He kept sniffing at the air, his nose pressed against the mesh, staring intently into the darkness. At first, we thought he was just being curious, but his focus didn't waver. He stayed at the tent opening, his little body tense. We decided to step outside and take a look, just in case something was out there. Armed with a flashlight, we scanned the edge of the clearing, but there was nothing to see. No glowing eyes, no movement, just the dark outline of trees. We went back to the fire, hoping Max would settle down if we gave him a little more time to adjust. But then he started growling. It was a deep, guttural sound I'd never heard from him before. The fur along his back stood straight up, and his gaze was fixed on one direction in the woods. Sent a chill down my spine. Max was a laid-back dog, not prone to barking or growling at nothing. We grabbed our hunting knife and an axe, just in case, and sat by the fire, listening. The woods were utterly silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the occasional crackle of the fire. Max's growling intensified, and then he started barking. A sharp, frantic bark that echoed in the stillness. We stayed like that for hours, Max on high alert, us straining to hear or see whatever had him so riled up. My partner eventually suggested turning on the truck's headlights to illuminate the campsite. The beams cut through the darkness, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance as the fire flickered. For a moment, everything was still. Max even laid down, though his ears stayed perked. I started to relax, convincing myself that whatever it was had moved on. Then we heard it. A loud snap, like a branch breaking, echoed from the woods. It wasn't distant, it was close. Too close. Max shot to his feet, barking furiously, his little body trembling. The sound had come from about 10 feet away, just beyond the reach of the truck's lights. We couldn't see anything, but the noise was unmistakable. Something heavy had broken that branch. I felt a wave of panic. My mind raced with possibilities: a bear, a cougar, maybe even a wolf. Predators were common in the area, and the thought of one lurking so close was terrifying. We grabbed Max and bolted for the truck. My heart was pounding as I climbed inside, locking the doors behind me. My partner turned on the engine, and we sat there, headlights illuminating the campsite, waiting. Minutes passed, then half an hour. Max calmed down a little, curling up in my lap, but his ears stayed alert, twitching at every little sound. We debated whether to stay or leave. The campsite felt exposed, vulnerable, but we didn't want to risk driving down the narrow, winding road in the dark. Eventually, the silence and the truck's warmth lulled us into a false sense of security. We convinced ourselves that whatever had been out there was gone. We stepped out cautiously, Max in my arms, and settled back by the fire. The night air felt heavier, the darkness pressing in closer than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Then it happened again. Another snap, louder this time, followed by a rustling sound. It was closer, right at the edge of the clearing. My stomach dropped. Max started barking wildly, his little body rigid in my arms. That was it. We weren't sticking around to find out what was out there. We grabbed our gear as quickly as we could, throwing it into the back of the truck without bothering to pack it properly. Max didn't stop barking the entire time. As we drove down the mountain, the headlights illuminating the narrow road ahead, I couldn't shake the feeling of something following us. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see glowing eyes or a dark shape emerging from the trees. When we finally reached the main road, I felt a wave of relief. The tension in my chest began to ease, but questions lingered in my mind. What had been out there? We told my partner's parents about the experience, expecting some understanding, but they laughed it off. They called us paranoid, said we'd overreacted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd made the right call. Maybe it was a cougar, maybe it was wolves, or maybe it was something else entirely. Something that had been watching us long before we noticed it. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that spot. What was once a place of peace and solitude now feels tainted, a reminder of how vulnerable you can be in the wilderness. One thing's for sure, I'll never ignore Max's instincts again. When I was 17, I made one of the most impulsive decisions of my life. I agreed to go camping with a group of people I barely knew. They were all a little older than me, early 20s mostly, and I'd only met them a handful of times through a mutual friend. The invitation sounded exciting, a chance to break out of my usual routine and prove I could keep up with the older crowd. I didn't think too hard about it. It was late summer in rural Idaho, and the plan was to drive out to a remote campground tucked deep into the Sawtooth Mountains. The place wasn't even on most maps. It was one of those spots someone always seems to know about, hidden and untouched by tourists, which really just meant it was inconvenient and hard to get to. There were 6 of us, packed into a battered SUV owned by a guy named Derek, who seemed to be the de facto leader of the group. I didn't know much about him except that he was loud, quick to laugh, and didn't seem to take anything too seriously. The others were his girlfriend, Emily, a quiet guy named Ryan, a woman named Kelly who brought enough booze to supply a small party, and me. The drive took hours, winding through dirt roads that became narrower and rougher the farther we went. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the dense pine forest. The spot itself was nothing special, just a clearing with a fire pit someone had built long ago. but it was surrounded by trees so thick it felt like the rest of the world didn't exist. We spent the first night drinking, laughing, and telling stories around the fire. I was trying to fit in, but there was an undercurrent to the group I couldn't quite put my finger on. Derek and Emily seemed tense with each other, and Ryan kept mostly to himself, staring into the flames like he wasn't really there. The second day started fine. We hiked a nearby trail, splashed around in a freezing creek, and lounged in the sun. But by late afternoon, things started to unravel. It began with a fight between Derek and Emily. I don't know what triggered it. I wasn't paying attention until their raised voices cut through the forest. Derek accused Emily of flirting with Ryan, and she called him paranoid and immature. The argument escalated quickly, with Derek storming off toward the car while Emily shouted after him. We all assumed he'd cool off and come back, but then we heard the engine start. Before we could even process what was happening, the SUV was gone, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. At first, we were more confused than anything. Why would he just leave? We figured he'd come back after blowing off steam, or at the very least, send someone to pick us up. None of us had a car, and this was back before everyone had cell phones. Even if we'd had one, there was no signal this far out. When night fell and Derek still hadn't returned, the mood shifted from annoyance to concern. We were 2 days into the trip, and our food supply was running low. We'd packed for 2 nights, assuming we'd leave on the 3rd day. Now, stranded without transportation or a way to contact anyone, the idea of staying another night wasn't appealing. That 3rd night was the longest of my life. We built a fire, but the warmth and light it provided did little to ease the growing tension. The forest around us felt different, darker, quieter, almost oppressive. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I kept imagining Derek out there somewhere, watching us, either too ashamed or too stubborn to come back. None of us slept much. The hunger wasn't unbearable yet, but it was there, gnawing at the edges of our thoughts. By morning, we knew we had to do something. The idea of walking to the main road came up, but we couldn't agree on it. Ryan wanted to stay put, reasoning that someone would eventually come looking for us. Kelly argued that waiting wasn't a plan. It was just hoping for the best. Emily was caught in the middle, clearly upset but unwilling to commit to either side. We ended up doing nothing, too indecisive and exhausted to act. By mid-morning, though, our luck changed. I was the first to hear it, a distant rumble of an engine cutting through the stillness. My heart leaped as I scrambled to my feet, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. A minute later, an old pickup truck appeared, its rusty exterior glinting in the sunlight. The truck belonged to a family, a middle-aged couple and their 2 kids, out for a weekend of camping. They looked surprised to find us there, and I can't blame them. We must have looked like a mess, dirty and tired with desperation etched across our faces. They didn't hesitate to help. After some quick discussion, they agreed to drive a few of us to the nearest town, about an hour away. Emily, Ryan, and I piled into the truck bed, leaving Kelly to watch over the campsite. The ride to town felt surreal. The wind whipped past us as the truck bounced along the rutted road, and for the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. When we reached the small town, the family dropped us off at a gas station, where we were able to call for help. By the time everything was sorted, rides arranged, gear retrieved, it was late afternoon. Derek never showed up, and we never figured out what went through his mind when he left us. That trip changed something in me. I'd always thought of myself as independent, capable of handling anything life threw at me. But being stranded out there, powerless and vulnerable, made me realize how quickly things can spiral out of control. I never saw or spoke to anyone from that group again. It wasn't intentional. Life just moved on. But I think about that trip sometimes, about how close we came to being just another story. A group of campers gone missing in the wilderness. It's a sobering thought, one that reminds me to always plan better and, most importantly, to choose my company wisely. I've always enjoyed camping alone. It clears my head, lets me disconnect from everything for a while, and puts me in touch with nature in a way nothing else can. This time, I picked a spot in southern Indiana, not far from Hoosier National Forest. It wasn't a popular area, exactly what I wanted. I wasn't looking for marked trails or campgrounds with RVs and families grilling hot dogs. I wanted solitude. I had 3 nights planned, just me, my hammock, and the woods. The first 2 nights were peaceful. I set up my hammock between 2 sturdy trees, rigged a tarp above it for cover, and had a small fire to cook my meals. The sounds of the forest at night, crickets, frogs, the occasional rustle of leaves, lulled me to sleep. By the 3rd night, I was fully relaxed. I'd spent the day exploring the nearby creek, taking in the stillness of the woods. My campsite was about 50 yards off an old Forest Service road that had been closed to vehicles years ago. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, and surrounded by thick trees. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m., needing to pee. The air was cold, and I could see my breath as I stepped out of my hammock. I walked about 10 feet from my setup, just far enough to avoid any unwanted smells later, when I noticed something strange. A light. It was faint but unmistakable. A headlamp, about 80 to 100 feet away, moving slightly among the trees. My first thought was that it might be another camper, but it didn't make sense. This wasn't a popular spot, and I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived. I stood there for a moment, watching. The light moved up and down, as if whoever it belonged to was sitting down and then standing up again. The longer I watched, the less it felt like the harmless actions of another camper. Something about the movements seemed deliberate, almost methodical, like they were waiting for something. I felt a chill that wasn't from the cold. Quietly, I slipped back to my hammock, pulled on my boots, and grabbed the small hatchet I always kept nearby for chopping firewood. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little less vulnerable. I decided to move to the right of my site, staying low and quiet. I didn't want to confront whoever it was directly, not yet. I just wanted to figure out what they were doing. As I crept through the underbrush, I kept my eyes on the headlamp, which hadn't moved much. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught another light. This one was closer, maybe 40 feet away, and moving in a slow, sweeping pattern, as if the person was scanning the area. My heart started pounding. I dropped to the ground and pulled some leaves over myself, hoping to blend in. The second figure walked closer, their headlamp casting long shadows as it moved. I could see their outline now. A man, tall and broad-shouldered. He was carrying something in his hand, but I couldn't make out what it was. He stopped about 10 feet from where I lay, close enough that I could hear the crunch of leaves under his boots. He lit a cigarette, the glow briefly illuminating his face, and then casually tossed an empty beer can on the ground. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, as he finished his smoke and walked off in the direction of the first headlamp. When he was far enough away, I slowly got to my feet and started making my way toward the first figure. I moved as quietly as I could, sticking to the shadows and avoiding any dry branches or leaves. As I got closer, I heard the faint sound of a phone vibrating. The light from the screen briefly lit up the figure's face. A man in his late 30s or 40s, scruffy, with a thin, wiry build. I crouched behind a tree, watching. He was texting or reading something on his phone, completely absorbed in it. Then, suddenly, he stood up and started walking toward my campsite. Panic surged through me, but I stayed frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Then I turned and began moving back toward my site, taking a wide arc to avoid crossing paths with him. As I got closer, I heard the unmistakable sound of my tarp being torn. I stopped, heart racing, and crouched behind a fallen log. Flashlights were sweeping across my campsite now, accompanied by the sound of my gear being tossed around. I heard one of them mutter something, though I couldn't make out the words. Then came the chilling part. He was just here. I stayed hidden, barely daring to move, as they continued to tear through my belongings. My mess kit was thrown into the bushes, my flashlight clicked on and off as they inspected it, and my hammock was slashed to ribbons. They weren't just stealing, they were destroying everything. Eventually, their lights began to fade as they moved away, back in the direction of the Forest Service Road. I stayed put until the first hints of dawn began to filter through the trees. Only then did I make my way back to the wreckage of my camp. The sight was gut-wrenching. My tarp and hammock were shredded, my mess kit was crushed, and my backpack was gone, along with my rain gear and flashlight. They hadn't taken my food, oddly enough, but everything else was either destroyed or missing. I decided to check the spots where I'd seen them. At the first location, I found a small pile of empty chew pouches, several beer cans, and a spent lighter. At the second spot, where the man had been smoking, there was an empty bag with powdery residue inside, which I later realized was meth, a mess of cigarette butts, and a pile of human waste. I didn't stick around to analyze it further. I packed up what little I had left and started hiking out, keeping my hatchet in hand the entire way. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made my heart jump, but I didn't see them again. When I finally reached my car, the relief was overwhelming. I threw my remaining gear in the trunk and drove straight to the nearest ranger station to report what had happened. The ranger listened, but there wasn't much they could do. The area was remote and without a solid description of the men or their vehicle. Assuming they even had one, tracking them down would be nearly impossible. Looking back, I still get chills thinking about how close they were to me, how methodically they destroyed my camp, and how easily things could have gone worse. I haven't been camping alone since, and I'm not sure I ever will again. I remember the summer of 2014 vividly. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a break from the monotony of daily life. The Pine Ridge Campground, nestled in the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania, was known for its family-friendly atmosphere. People came from all over to camp near the quaint town of Millhaven, where chocolate-themed attractions, charming shops, and scenic hiking trails drew crowds throughout the summer months. I had planned this trip for weeks. It was just me, my old Jeep, and a small cabin I had rented for the weekend. A tiny structure with peeling red paint, a creaky front porch, and a thin layer of dust that seemed to settle on everything. It wasn't much, but it had a bed, a kitchenette, and most importantly, a roof. The first 2 days were uneventful. I spent my time hiking, roasting marshmallows over a small fire, and reading a tattered paperback I found in the cabin. It was peaceful, quiet, everything I had hoped for, but that changed on the third day. It started when a family set up camp in the clearing beside my cabin. A woman and her 3 kids, a girl around 12, a boy who couldn't have been older than 7, and the youngest maybe 4. They arrived late in the afternoon, unloading a battered minivan packed to the brim with camping gear. The woman caught my attention immediately. She looked out of place, like someone who didn't belong in the woods. Her long, dark hair was tied back in a messy bun, and she wore a faded t-shirt that hung loosely over her slight frame. Her face was drawn, eyes darting around as if she were constantly scanning for something or someone. She introduced herself briefly when I passed by, a quick wave and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her name was Marissa, she said, and she was originally from Trinidad, but they had been living in Florida before coming here. Her voice was soft, with a lilting Caribbean accent. "They're letting people into the Hershey School soon," she mentioned. almost as if talking to herself. "I'm trying to get my kids in. It's a good school, you know? A chance for them to have a better life." I nodded politely, unsure what to say. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the campfire flickered to life, Marissa stopped by my cabin again. She seemed more relaxed, the tension in her shoulders eased by the warmth of the fire. The kids played nearby, their laughter a temporary escape from whatever weight she carried. "They need this," she said, watching them. "A chance to be kids. It's been tough." She hesitated, then added quietly, "Their father, he's in some trouble, back in Trinidad. Mafia trouble." The words hung in the air like smoke. I didn't know how to respond. What do you say to someone who casually drops something like that into a conversation? I managed a weak, "That sounds complicated." Marissa gave a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. Complicated doesn't begin to cover it. As the night wore on, I retreated to my cabin, leaving Marissa and her kids by their tent. The sounds of the campground faded into the background. The crackling fire, the chirping crickets, the distant hum of conversations. I was just starting to drift off to sleep when I heard something, a soft knock at the door. I sat up, heart pounding. It was almost midnight. Who could it be? I opened the door to find Marissa standing there, but she wasn't the calm, reserved woman I had met earlier. Her eyes were wide, wild with fear. In her hand, she clutched a machete, an old, rusted blade that looked far too large for her small frame. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The Mafia. They've found me." I stared at her, unsure if I was dreaming. "Please," she begged, "help me. They're in the woods, watching." My first instinct was to shut the door, to lock it and pretend this wasn't happening. But something in her eyes, something raw and desperate, stopped me. I stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around us. "Marissa," I said slowly, "I think you might be imagining things. No one's here." She shook her head violently. No, you don't understand. They've been following me since Florida, since before that. They don't stop." I glanced toward the dark tree line, half expecting to see shadowy figures emerging from the woods. But there was nothing, just the quiet rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Stay here," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'll keep watch." Marissa nodded, clutching the machete like a lifeline. She backed away, disappearing into the shadows with a flashlight. I watched the beam of light flicker through the trees, moving erratically as she searched for something or someone that wasn't there. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed, fully clothed, with one hand resting on the handle of the hunting knife I kept for emergencies. Every creak, every rustle outside the cabin made my heart race. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The next morning, I woke early, the events of the night before playing on a loop in my mind. I stepped outside to find the campsite eerily quiet. No sign of Marissa or her kids. I made my way to the campground office, a small building near the entrance with a faded wooden sign that read Pine Ridge Campground Office and General Store. That's when I saw her. Marissa was slumped over on the bench outside, her head resting on her knees, arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked like a different person, hollow, defeated, as if whatever fight had kept her going had finally run out. I approached cautiously. "Marissa!" She didn't respond. The campground manager, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a concerned expression, came out of the office. "Is she okay?" "I don't know," I admitted. She had a rough night." The manager called for an ambulance. Within minutes, the paramedics arrived, lifting Marissa onto a stretcher. She didn't resist, didn't say a word. As they drove away, the police arrived. Two officers in crisp uniforms, their presence a stark contrast to the quiet campground. They asked questions about Marissa, about the kids, about what had happened. I told them everything I knew, which wasn't much. Just fragments of a story that didn't make sense. Later that day, I watched as the police led Marissa's children away. The girl, the oldest, held her brother's hands tightly, her face set in a mask of calm that no 12-year-old should have to wear. I packed up my things and left the campground soon after. The peaceful retreat I had hoped for was gone, replaced by a lingering sense of unease. I never saw Marissa again, never found out what happened to her or her children. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows stretch long, I think about them, about a mother running from demons, real or imagined, about 3 kids caught in the crossfire of a life they didn't choose. And I wonder if they ever found the safety they were searching for.